This research has consumed me over the past 2 weeks, and I truly think it's going to change how you draft wide receivers, specifically one of my favorite draft targets we're going to talk about at the end of the video. But here, this is the concluding video where we look at the top 5 offenses in the NFL every season over the past 10 years. Specifically here for this video, we are going to look at the wide receiver one for that offense and how they finished from a fantasy football perspective, aka half PPR points per game. So for an example, if we're looking at the top 5 offenses in 2023, from a total points perspective, that was Dallas at 1, the Niners at 2, the Dolphins at 3, the Ravens, the Lions. For fantasy football purposes, their wide receiver ones were CeeDee Lamb, Deebo Samuel, Tyreek Hill, Zay Flowers, Amon-Ra St. Brown. And those wide receivers finish as the wide receiver 2, the wide receiver 10, the wide receiver 1, the wide receiver 31, and the wide receiver 4 from a fantasy perspective. Now, I'm not going to go through every single season. I think that we can just show you the data here. You can just trust me on it. And I'm going to go through and tell you what actually matters from this sample size of 50 wide receivers. And we are cross-referencing this with the 50 wide receivers that over the past 10 seasons were in the bottom 5 offenses in the NFL. Now, this is the most shocking. And I obviously know, yes, players in good offenses will be better in fantasy football than players in bad offenses. I had no idea it mattered this much at wide receiver. I'm convinced now I'm never drafting a wide receiver that projects out to be in a bad offense. Let's look at this. It's unbelievable. So the bad offenses, those are categorized by if you were a bottom 5 team in the NFL in total points scored in that season, whether it's 2015, 2016, 2023, doesn't matter. Good offenses, you are a top 5 offense in total points scored. And then looking at the wide receiver ones, if we are looking at these thresholds, both samples have 50 wide receivers in them. In the good offenses, out of those 50 wide receivers, 48 of them managed to finish as top 36 options. So if you're in a top 5 offense, your wide receiver one has a 96% chance to be a top 36 wide receiver in fantasy. This is essentially cut in half if you're in a bottom 5 offense, where you only have a 52% chance to be a top 36 option. So that's not the end of the world, right? We now know, yes, if you're in a top 5 offense in the NFL, you're pretty much guaranteed to at least put out a wide receiver 3 at the very minimum. Where things get nuts is when we begin looking at the thresholds beyond this. If you were in a bad offense, for you to put out a top 24 wide receiver in fantasy, you had a 16% chance. If you were in the good offense category, you had an 88% chance to put out a top 24 wide receiver. I'm no mathematician here, but that's 5x. You're 5 times more likely to be a top 24 wide receiver if you're in a top 5 offense versus a bottom 5 offense. Now, what gets even crazier is when we look at the top guys. If you're in a top 5 offense, that wide receiver one has a 68% chance to be a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy. However, if you were in a bad offense, you have a 4% chance. The only 2 guys from bottom 5 offenses over the past 10 seasons to put up top 12 finishes in fantasy were Mike Evans in 2014 and Jarvis Landry in 2017. Whereas 68% of wide receiver ones in top 5 offenses managed to do so. Now you go over to top 9 wide receivers in fantasy. There was not a single finish from the bottom 5 offenses over the past 10 seasons inside the top 9 receivers in fantasy. Whereas you have a higher than 50% chance to do so if you're in a top 5 offense and you're the wide receiver one there. 56% of the time, a top 5 offense will put out a top 9 wide receiver in fantasy. And looking at the cream of the crop, looking at the elite guys, looking at the who's who, if you are in a top 5 offense in the NFL, you have a 24% chance, if you're the wide receiver one, to be a top 3 wide receiver in fantasy that season. That 24% number is so high, and what is so funny is if we compare it to the bad offenses, you are more likely to be a top 3 wide receiver in fantasy if you're in a top 5 offense in the NFL and you're the wide receiver one, versus you are to be a top 24 wide receiver in fantasy if you're in a bottom 5 offense in the NFL and you're the wide receiver one. Let me repeat that. Over the past 10 years, you've been more likely to be a top 3 overall wide receiver in fantasy than a top 24 option if you're in a bottom 5 offense versus a top 5 offense. This data, in my mind, just screams you need to draft elite level wide receivers. So looking at how we can find those guys this next season, the best resource that we can have for total points scored coming into this next year, obviously this is not a guarantee. Nothing in the NFL is a guarantee, but Vegas sportsbooks, they are going to give us the best projections with implied team totals. I promise you it's going to be better than whatever you can find on YouTube, whatever I can put out, whatever you can put out, whatever anybody else making videos can put out. If you're watching someone making a video and they say, over a large sample, I can beat Las Vegas sportsbooks on NFL over-under, run for the hills. They're probably lying to you. If they weren't, I probably wouldn't be making videos on YouTube. I'll tell you that much. Now, anyway, the top offenses projecting out in the NFL this season are the Niners, Lions, Chiefs, Dolphins, Bills, Bengals, Ravens, Cowboys. Right now, Vegas is saying these are the offenses that have a chance to be inside the top 5. We're going to be very brief with a lot of these teams because what am I supposed to do? Come out and tell you, oh yeah, Deebo Samuel, the wide receiver that's going in round 2 of underdog drafts right now, you should draft him. He's going to be in a very good off. We know that already. Okay. If you are looking at Deebo Samuel, this is a wide receiver that this past season, 14.5 fantasy points per game. If you look at the historical comps, the guys that had similar age 27 seasons going into their age 28 year, you had AJ Green, Greg Jennings, Doug Baldwin, Mike Evans, Brandon Cooks, Derek Mason, Deshaun Jackson, Randy Moss. You're anywhere from about 13 points per game up to 18.5 points per game. Deebo Samuel, a very safe pick. Now, at the time of this recording, Brandon Ayuk is still a San Francisco 49er. Now, with the Ayuk case, like I said, if he gets dealt, you have to be severely concerned because while Brandon Ayuk is an extremely talented receiver, what makes Ayuk so appealing in fantasy and why he was going in round 2 of underdog drafts at the moment is because this should be the best offense in the NFL. Now, if Ayuk does end up getting dealt to like Carolina, if he gets dealt to the Giants, if he gets dealt to Washington, and he goes from a top 5 offense to a borderline bottom 5 offense, even if he has a significantly higher target share in his new offense because there's less competition, like I said, if you're in a top 5 offense, you have a higher chance to be a wide receiver 1, 2, or 3 overall in fantasy than just a top 24 option in general. So I don't want to say that 1-for-1 with Brandon Ayuk, but it goes to show how important offensive situation is for these wide receivers in fantasy. And if Ayuk were to get dealt to those bottom 5 teams, I'm running for the hills. Right now, if you're looking at their underdog pick'ems, underdog has Deebo Samuel at 5.5 receiving touchdowns, higher, lower, 725.5 receiving yards, higher, lower. But they have Brandon Ayuk, same mark, 5.5 receiving touchdowns, but they have Ayuk much higher at 950.5 receiving yards. Now, keep in mind, Deebo also gives you the rushing component added on. Now, I'm not going to waste your time with the Detroit Lions. Detroit's very clear cut. You have a wide receiver 1 here with Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's going to have everything. If you look at where he's being drafted currently in underdog drafts, he's a round 1 pick. I mean, he is currently going as the wide receiver 5. So, breaking news. Amon-Ra St. Brown is being drafted a wide receiver 5, has top 3 upside. We already know that. Draft St. Brown, feel comfortable about it. Historical comps look great. Numbers last year look great. Offense projects out this season looks great. Now, going over to the Chiefs, this is a very fun discussion to have because the Chiefs, you don't have those round 1 picks at the moment. You are looking at Rashee Rice, Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy as the top candidates right now in KC. Personally, on Underdog, I have not drafted any Hollywood Brown. Hollywood Brown's had an ADP of about 52 as the wide receiver 32, where I'm willing to say, yes, if we look at Hollywood, he's gotten worse every year over the past 3 seasons. He's been on a straight decline. He got paid absolutely nothing to go to KC this year. He averaged 1.3 yards per route run last season. Now, obviously, it's going to be a way better situation in Kansas City. It's probably a very good signing for the Chiefs, and he's probably going to be a great NFL player this next season. But from a fantasy football perspective, do I think Hollywood is top 5 upside? Do I think he has top 12 upside? Probably not at this point of his career based on what we've seen with trends over the past 3 seasons. I would, especially if you look at his range of outcomes. I mean, if we look at guys that at age 26 seasons similar to him, their age 27 year, you had Emmanuel Sanders, Plaxico Burress, Lee Evans. We don't need to go through all the names. Anyway, you had about 3.5 to 19 points per game. Sanders obviously actually popped, but really the median expectations about 10 points per game. And on Underdog right now, if you love Hollywood Brown, they have his totals at 4.5 receiving touchdowns and 750.5 receiving yards. You can go chase Hollywood there. If you really wanted to take the hires, you do you. I'm probably not doing it. But yeah, of course, you can find that on Underdog Fantasy. That link's in the description. That's in the comment section. Same place that I'm drafting literally every single night on the live stream. Same place I've drafted every day for years. By far and away, my favorite place to draft. It's best ball, so there's no time commitment at all during the season. It's how I draft hundreds of teams every offseason. It's how I won $150,000 on Underdog 2 years ago. And yeah, if you want to draft with me in a live stream, or if you want to go check out any of those pick'ems, you can find the link in the description and the comment section. And if you use code FLOCK, you are going to get my 2024 fantasy football draft guide. Code FLOCK will hook you up with my 2024 fantasy football rankings, and code FLOCK will get you a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. Now, moving over to Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, wide receiver 37, wide receiver 38. I'm completely fine paying both price tags. We know this should be a great Chiefs offense. Kelsey, another year older. It's hard to imagine that he has the same target share that we've seen over the past 3 seasons. Hollywood Brown's been a disappointing wide receiver who's declined for 3 straight seasons. Rashee Rice, great rookie year. You just have to worry about the suspension. Xavier Worthy, promising prospect, goes round 1 of the NFL draft. I would way rather draft Xavier Worthy at wide receiver 38 or Rashee Rice, wide receiver 37, than Hollywood at wide receiver 32. Now, like I said, I'm not going to be able to sit here and go, oh, breaking news, good offenses equal a ton of points for wide receivers, draft Tyreek Hill. I mean, Tyreek Hill is already being drafted as what? The wide receiver 2. He had 20 points per game pretty much last season. Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle are already priced extremely highly. This video doesn't really help you at all with that. I apologize, but yes, you're probably pretty safe to draft Tyreek and Waddle. Now, this is what this video comes down to. This entire video, very similar to how like us looking at the wide receivers that struggled. I mean, really, even if you were a bona fide stud, like going back and looking at DeAndre Hopkins with Brock Osweiler and looking at so many examples over the past 10 years of that. Y'all know that one video, the big takeaway was, don't draft Malik Neighbors to the 2-3 turn on Underdog. If you're drafting with your ESPN college buddies, he goes round 6, sure, take him. But the big takeaway for this video, listen up and listen good. Right now, the Buffalo Bills, according to Las Vegas sportsbooks, project out to be a top 5 offense in the NFL. If we look at the historical data, way more likely than not, the Buffalo Bills will produce a top 24 wide receiver in fantasy and a wide receiver that has top 12 upside in fantasy. That's, of course, if they do hit these projections. That's, of course, if they are a top 5 team in the NFL in terms of total points scored, which Vegas is currently projecting. They have been in the past. And yeah, I don't want to say it's the safest thing in the world. Nothing in the NFL is guaranteed, but the Bills should be a very good offense this next year, or at least that's how I'm going to be drafting my teams under that assumption. So now we got to figure out which Bills receiver is possibly worth taking a swing on and at what price are they? Because like I said, I'm not breaking any massive news here. Oh, draft CeeDee Lamb, draft Tyreek Hill, draft Amon-Ra St. Brown. Yes, we know these are good offenses. We know you should take them. But Keon Coleman, right now, if you look at his Underdog ADP, is currently going at wide receiver 47. Let me pull up where he's going in regular redraft leagues, because to be completely honest with you, Keon Coleman, while he's probably going to start slow at the beginning of the season, I would still be completely fine pulling the trigger on him in like a standard redraft league where you're going to have to throw him at the bottom end of your bench. So Keon Coleman is a little more expensive if you're just drafting with your ESPN college buddies. There he is, wide receiver 44. What's very interesting is Keon Coleman's much cheaper on Underdog in comparison to ESPN if you are referencing, say, Xavier Worthy, Ladd McConkey, and Rome Odunze as other comparable guys. But anyway, with Keon Coleman, I want to be honest with you, I was not a massive fan of this prospect profile. This is a wide receiver that at Michigan State breaks out as a true sophomore. You'll love to see it. Going over to Florida State, we operate under the assumption, okay, based off the hype, based off the pedigree this guy has, he's going to go over to Florida State. He's an elite level athlete. He is going to absolutely dominate from a market share perspective. He puts up decent counting stats. He's 11 touchdowns through 12 games. But if you look at the overall volume that's there at Florida State, Keon Coleman doesn't really account for a super high percentage of it. And overall, his metric profile coming into the NFL isn't the most impressive thing in the world. And then he goes to the NFL Combine. He's not exactly as athletic as advertised. Still athletic, don't get me wrong. So I'm sitting here going, oh, Keon Coleman, I don't really like the prospect profile. But then he is selected at pick 33 in the NFL draft to the Buffalo Bills. He is a borderline round 1 NFL draft pick to a top 5 offense with no wide receivers on the depth chart. So here's what I do with that analysis that I had saying, oh my gosh, I didn't like Keon Coleman as a prospect. Let me take it, let's crumple it up, and let's throw it as far away as we possibly can because it is no longer relevant. This situation is so damn good. I'm wrong about prospects all the freaking time. I didn't see Puka Nacua. Trust me, I wish I did. I'd have a lot more money, but it is what it is. And if we go over and look at the other wide receivers in Buffalo, completely understands if Curtis Samuel was sitting here and Curtis Samuel was going 5 rounds after Keon Coleman, I would be with y'all. I would get the chatter going, oh, you know what? You know, it was a sneaky pick this year. Curtis Samuel. Curtis Samuel, best situation of his entire NFL career. He was a pretty talented player back in his days at Carolina. Maybe just the situation wasn't good with horrible quarterback play back in Washington. I would be in that camp and I would be agreeing with you. But then you pull up and actually see where Curtis Samuel's getting drafted. And I mean, obviously it's a tale of two stories. If you go over and you look at, say, ESPN, Curtis Samuel's pick 148. He is going, how many picks after Keon Coleman? There he is going about 33 selections after Keon Coleman. However, if you pull up Underdog, Curtis Samuel's 10 picks after Keon Coleman. In a live stream the other night, Curtis Samuel went freaking before Keon. And we sit here and go, okay, I agree. Yeah, Curtis Samuel is going to be in the best situation of his career. But what has his career been so far? He's a wide receiver that's now going into his 8th season where he's had 1 year with more than 9.0 fantasy points per game in a half PPR league. 1 season out of 7 with more than 9 points per game. Yes, the best situation of his career. Yes, sneaky player in best ball, depending on the price. For you to take him in the same round as Keon Coleman, who's a borderline round 1 NFL draft pick at 21 years old, where the sky's the limit, it makes no sense to me. Even if you look at the Underdog pick'ems right now, Keon Coleman's at 725.5 receiving yards, Curtis Samuel at 625. And you have to keep in mind, these rookies should naturally improve as the season goes on, where they give you the upside to take down tournaments in weeks 15, 16, 17, or if you're drafting on Underdog and Best Ball Mania, it's a $25 buy-in, $1.5 million for first place, and you really need to have the ceiling in the final 3 weeks. Keon Coleman's the guy with that ceiling. And I would agree, we could sit here and go, oh, you know what, Khalil Shakir, he's interesting. Shakir is a wide receiver that really hasn't done much through the first 2 years of his NFL career. Yeah, he had no pedigree, but it's a wide open depth chart. You have Josh Allen. He's the only guy that was really there last season. So let's ignore the fact that he had 23 intended air yards per game last year. Let's ignore the fact that, he's averaged 21 intended air yards per game through his NFL career. Let's all of a sudden go in on him. And let's ignore, if you look at his historical comps based off his age 23 season, that the following year at age 24, his best comp averaged 7.5 points per game. Let's ignore all of that and pretend Shakir's a super interesting player. I'll let you know right now, if Shakir played on the Jags, you probably wouldn't even know who he is. And then you pull up his ADP and you go, oh, Shakir's being drafted at wide receiver 55 right before Brock Purdy, Caleb Williams, Trey Benson. I am in on drafting the Buffalo Bills wide receivers because of this historical data showing us how likely, if you are a top 5 offense in the NFL, you are to put out one of those wide receivers that just gives you an insane ceiling. But in my mind, I think it would have made sense to go Curtis Samuel. It would have made sense to go Shakir. If people were pricing in Keon Coleman as the solidified wide receiver 1 in this offense, and there was a massive difference between all these options. But the thing is, they are all going almost back to back to back. And in my mind, to not take the guy that just was a borderline round 1 NFL draft pick at 21 years old, regardless of what you thought about him as a prospect, regardless of the coaching staff saying, oh yeah, he has a lot to learn. He's 21 years old. It's crazy. Keon Coleman at this point, I think at wide receiver 47, you get him as a wide receiver 5 pretty much, is going to be one of my most drafted guys. Now, going over, like I said, similar to Tyreek Hill, I'm not going to sit here and go, oh, based off this data, draft a lot of Jamar Chase. Everybody already knows that. Chase is a round 1 pick. There's nothing to discuss there. T. Higgins already going in round 4. Not much to discuss there. People kind of understand. Good Bengals offense. These guys should be great now. Where this could be a very interesting conversation, similar to Keon Coleman, is going over and looking at Zay Flowers. Now, yes, the Ravens were a top 5 offense last season, and yes, Zay Flowers did not give you that elite finish. Zay Flowers was also a rookie, okay? We already had the video where we showed the historical data for wide receivers going from their rookie season to their second season, and how typically drafting these guys that showed as rookies going into year 2 is a great bet. And also, drafting these guys that project to be in very good offenses at wide receiver is a great bet. Zay Flowers is in the middle of that Venn diagram there, so it should be really exciting. But the thing is, you pull up Underdog drafts, Zay Flowers right now going before the tight end 1 and Sam Laporta, going before the QB 1 and Josh Allen. I still love his positional rank, wide receiver 26. I'm going to soak up as much Zay Flowers as I can there. I just think that's kind of a range of Underdog drafts where wide receivers probably a little too aggressively ranked, where I'd way rather take Zay Flowers and where I think he's a super compelling pick. It's just in your regular redraft league, what's crazy is there he's actually going as the wide receiver 24, which would be closer to my rankings. But you actually get him at the 5-6 turn. And taking Zay Flowers at the beginning of round 6, after you're able to grab a couple running backs early and take that wide receiver that has a lot of upside and, has a lot of promise based off those 2 categories that we previously mentioned. I think Flowers is another great example of a wide receiver that this data supports. He's a great pick depending on the price that you get him. In Underdog drafts, best ball drafts, he's probably a little bit rich. I'm still taking him with where he's going. I'm just not going to be pounding the table like I am for Keon Coleman. However, in your regular redraft league, if you get him in round 6, I'm all about it. Now, the last offense that we're going to have here that looks like it projects out to where it can be in the top 5 is Dallas, but CeeDee Lamb's already going as the wide receiver 1, right? Am I supposed to... What am I supposed to do? Oh, based off this video, take CeeDee Lamb over Christian McCaffrey. No, it's a completely different conversation, and yeah, you can't really move him up much higher, so... I think that this data here is some of the most shocking data I've seen from a fantasy football perspective pretty much this year. And how I am applying it is these guys that project out to be in very good offenses where the depth chart is uncertain and you get a massive discount on them. aka Keon Coleman, give me as much of that guy as I possibly can get, especially in these tournaments where who cares about the floor? We're chasing the highest ceiling possible. But thank you again. Really do appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day. And yeah, I'll be live tonight drafting Underdog teams as I am every night. So if you want to draft with me, that link's in the description, comment section. Code FLOCK, hook you up with my draft guide, my 2024 rankings, and a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. But thank you. Appreciate you and hope to be drafting against you tonight.